So we are back. So with this thing, how human ego, its various manifestations have been touched upon in this chapter. So we have reached a stage where there are where Iqbal is discussing Nietzsche here in a certain context of something called Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, and this very idea is has many layers to it, and it's one of the most important ingredients of how in the 19th century, and how maybe in the Iqbalian literature you can see time and again, both in poetry as well as prose, and maybe in the last part of this religion possible. There are, I would say, Iqbal has given a sort of being judgmental, but in a sympathetic tone towards Nietzsche in that sense. So here there are two, three ideas which we are going to discuss in this lecture, which are the overriding themes of this thing. One is Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence, and then the idea of notion of God and how it is related with universe. So if you in the translate it in terms of in Urdu literature or in the thing, it's the debate of Wahdatul Wujud or Wahdatul Shuhud, Shuhudis and Wujudis. These are two camps, or if you want a more Upanishadic or term, these are the Brahman and Atman, the binary, and how human self, the Atman, how it relates to the larger cosmic self in that sense, and how these ideas can be seen, how the notions of this post-Darwinian synthesis, which is a very important background, or it's the important axiom in which these ideas of Nietzsche, they seem to we can well place them in a certain background, in the certain Darwinian way of looking things, because things are always in evolution. But Nietzsche's evolution, as it seems, it's a sort of evolution, but it's sort of evolution which is not original, or which is pathetically, in the Iqbalian terms, masquerading eternal recurrence in some sense. So you again repeat, and you are repeating things in cycles, and you are starting reaching where you started again and again. So it's a certain cyclical notion of time which you can arrive at, as compared to the way Iqbalian appreciation of time is more, or Bergsonian appreciation of time is more a creative time, as a creative engagement in that sense. Where now, every now is a creative now in that sense. It has not to be seen in terms of past, or it has not necessarily to be seen in terms of future. It's now in now sense. So which Iqbal also calls something called eternal now. So this idea is perfectly conflated with how Nietzsche wants to see this idea of eternal recurrence. And many people who might have read Nietzsche, and the way Nietzsche in the literary sense, just as a religious, what I should say, prophet, tries to invoke Zarathustra in that sense, how he has this cycle of recurrence which is imposed out there in that sense. So one important point which I found maybe interesting in that sense is that Nietzsche was basically wrestling with late 19th century ideas of time, the Kantian notions of empiricism, the Kantian notions, as well as the axiom of linear notion of time, which can be inferred indirectly from the Newtonian way of looking at physics. So a sort of linearity, a sort of circularity, which can be inferred in that sense. So what Nietzsche might have been this is not I have so this is how I see it. It's not necessarily people read it that way. So it's like how he just what I should say placed or placated a certain 19th century understanding of time, which was indirectly inferred from the way the Kantian way of looking at emphasizing things and trying to see time in that linear sense, which can also be inferred in some cyclical sense, and maybe taking that notion of time and imposing it on a certain worldview, which is, you can take it religious. You can say it's a worldview which is not religious worldview, but that non-religious worldview has a certain religious import in that sense. So when materialism, or if materialism, or there is nothing outside matter, empiricism is reigned supreme fundamentally, so there is no need for God in that sense. So that anchor, the base, that thing which traditional. So I am remembered of a poem, if I remember, of Robert Browning, or some poet. He says, English poet, that how good were the days when people used to believe in God. At least there was some thing to, even if it's not the matter that God is or is not in that fundamental sense. So, but there was a certain solace attached to it, and that solace has been fundamentally, what I should say, that foundation has been somehow questioned, or that has been somewhat Nietzsche is trying to come up to basically the groundedness of that being, which was ultimately creator, or it might have been a Christian theology, a belief in God in a certain sense. So in the way of the way Kantian emphasized notions, and the way people took the linear notions of time in that sense. So Nietzsche's understanding of time as things eternally recurring in some fundamental sense, and how did he found a panic or solution of the purpose. If religion, there is no purpose, what is the purpose in that sense? So that in that sense, you can say it's like you are again and again trying to see something, and to each cycle you just a notion of time, or a notion of a teleology or a future, where you can come back again where you started. So nothing really excites, or nothing really is exciting, and it leads to a sort of you can say nihilism, a sort of nothingness. There is nothing is exciting, and everything is the same, and even nothing will not excite you in that sense, and nothing is same, so you will come back. So at that foundational level, you can say, so there comes the ashes. You come If you come to that realization, that realization will lead to you sort of a feeling of coming, a feeling of, if you realize that thing, and that will let you to move towards the forward rush of life in some fundamental sense. In that sense, the way Nietzsche is critiquing Plato and Socrates, and Christian theology, or all the people who lead people to dead end, that thing. So he is trying to say things have to be seen afresh in that sense, in the forward sense, and trying to basically discover and basically rediscover, or trying to, even if it may be nihilistic, it may be disappointing, you come back to where you started, but in that process things will make you will be strong in some fundamental sense, and in that sense you will discover the will to power, and you will realize that truth is not for the sake of truth. It means power is truth in that sense. We worship power in some sense that truth is power in that sense, and it's a sort of panica of Nietzsche. So how Iqbal tries to see it, and there are maybe many couple of observations which we are going to read, and then connect it with the larger debates of these whether the wujudis and shuhudis in that sense. So for example, if I quote Nietzsche in some sense. So I'll quote only. So this there is, however, in the history of modern thought, one positive view of morality. I mean Nietzsche's doctrine of eternal recurrence. So in that sense, what he says, he says the doctrine proceeds on the assumption that the quantity of energy and the universe is constant and constantly finite. Space is only subject to form. There is no meaning. So in his view of time, however, Nietzsche parts company with Kant and Schopenhauer. So maybe this is a subtle point. Maybe I have to say from a physics background how maybe Nietzsche was more in trying to see a non-physicist, literary person trying to, but maybe absorbing the wisdom, physics wisdom of his age, consciously or unconsciously, and trying to see it in his own way. In that sense, so, and in another sentence, for example, such is Nietzsche's eternal recurrence. It's only a more rigid kind of mechanism based on an ascertained fact, but only working hypothesis of science. Nor does Nietzsche seriously grapple with the question of time. So this is a remark of Iqbal on. There are remarks at the end also, but here this is an important remark. Nor does seriously Nietzsche grapple with the question of time. So here we'll just see this eternal recurrence in some sense, and then we can just make sense toward this remark, what he wants to say. Nor does Nietzsche seriously grapple with the question of time. So Nietzsche himself feels this and describes his doctrine not as a one of immortality, but rather as a view of life which makes immortality endurable. So everything is eternal. So he's this boring idea of repetition and recurrence. It's not appealing to Iqbal. So we'll see first how Nietzsche sees it, then we can connect it. So for example, the doctrine of eternal recurrence of the same cohorts in the most intimate way that of will to power, which I was trying to say. So eternal return of the same constitutes Nietzsche's fundamental metaphysical position in the Western thought. So barefoot of teaching as its ground, Nietzsche's philosophy is the tree without roots, in the words of Heidegger. And root is only when we pursue the question as to how the trunk stands upon its roots. So it's like roots are being just created. So here I just maybe quote my paragraph which I had written long back. So in that sense, let me capture Nietzsche's appreciation. Nietzsche's that, or let me capture the thing times post Nietzschean or Nietzschean thing, when there is no hope of understanding, no paradigm to compare, no ideology to share, and no epistemology to test things upon, then nihilism seems to be easier solution, although still it requires a lot of energy and pass into dark nothingness as an escape route. So if that is the state that we don't know where the root is the rooted, your base is always shaking, on which you put things, and the question is the notion of morality, Christian morality or general morality of where maybe Nietzsche might have this, might be beyond good and evil. So where you famously said God is not God. If God is not dead, yes or no, or yes, God is dead, but which God? So God of morality, the Christian God, is dead in that sense. So it's old now. So the question is that The doctrine of will to power springs from nothing else than eternal return. So you can say in that sense, so here the point important is that how if this doctrine of eternal return, which is part of reaching to that faithlessness, or it leads to a sort of I can say groundedness, because you again come back and back where you started, and that realization, if that realization is there, it will make you in that sense that will to power may become stronger in you at every stage, and that is the purpose in that sense. In that sense, you can say it. And that returning may overcome that nihilistic thing, in that sense, that nihilism, if it has to be just bypassed, it has to be overgrown. You can grow that nihilism. You have to come up. For example, when Zoroaster famously said, "Who is the shepherd in whose gorge snake prowled?" So everything is not indifferent, so that nothing is worthwhile. It's all alike, which I was saying means everything is same and nothing is same in that sense. So here, if you want to connect, is in that sense, is maybe there can be 1-2 points which I read, which, for example, which I have said about Iqbal's idea that so nor does Nietzsche seriously grapple with the question of time. He takes it objectively and regards it merely as an infinite series of events turning ourselves again and again. So maybe in the light of previous readings of how Iqbal and Bergson and maybe other people and these white hidden time, you can appreciate time if you want to read Nietzsche in a critical way, in the reading of that understanding of time, which is not even if we take the Kantian notion of time, or Kantian which Iqbal also says somewhere else, that Nietzsche's understanding of universe is out and out materialistic in that sense. So if that thing is not to be taken, if you take, for example, there is something called this Leibniz idea of indiscriminables. Means if two things are equivalent to the same thing, they should be equal to the same thing. You should not be able to differentiate between the two things. For example, if there are two books and there is a third book, but if the color of all the three books is white, and if you compare these two books with the third book, if its dimensions, length, color are same, and both of these books are relating to that book, you can see these books are one and the same thing. So in that sense, this idea of indiscriminables from a logical point of view, you can say in each Nietzsche's cycle, if the cycle gets repeated, you cannot differentiate one cycle from that another cycle. In that sense, this thing is that this idea of repetition, it somehow seems logically fallacious, even though it has been indirectly inferred from a certain understanding of time, which was linear in that sense. And here you can compare the Leibnizian way of looking at relative notions of time and Newtonian understanding of space and time. So whether the extrapolation of Nietzsche would not have been physics sense in the hard sense, maybe in some indirect sense, but you can critique it in that sense also. In that sense, but if you are out and out Newtonian and out and out materialist, you can take Nietzsche's idea. You can have an argumentation from that. But since Nietzsche died in maybe 1900, he was not aware of quantum theory and a lot of these debates of determinism and indeterminism. This primarily maybe anchor, which Iqbal also discussed at the end, has been that of Darwin. Darwin's theory of evolution in that sense, and things are evolving and evolving in that sense. But if the evolution is not creative, if the evolution is only going, but that sense, so how he wants to see purpose and other things in that sense. So it's an another idea. These are ideas which I'll connect later in that sense. So here, how does Iqbal see it? There are other maybe writings. There's an essay of Iqbal on some Iqbal where he talks of, for example, he says each state that occurred has always occurred, and infinitely many of them. So each state that will occur will therefore recursively occur many times. Means both first and second. So the world process is a periodic or cyclical in that sense. So you can say, you can read it if you want to read these Nietzsche's ideas in the physics background before we are going to connect it in with the philosophy of life and other things. So if we interestingly see Iqbal's other writings, he has quoted Nietzsche. He wants to defend, because there have been a lot of critics of Iqbal also in his own times. Also, maybe people like Edward G. Brownie and maybe Nicholson. For example, Edward G. Brownie is saying that Iqbal is the Oriental adaptation of Nietzsche, and about Nicholson, he says that Iqbal has his philosophy is primarily in the elements of Nietzsche has been there in that sense. So Iqbal has been consciously trying to defend. If you read Reconstruction later chapters, also he's trying to consciously appreciate as well as defend his own point of view, where he says that his notion of this his philosophy is being impressed upon from Quran, as maybe for example he talks of doctrine of absolute unity as expounded by Al-Jili in that sense, where he talks of being as it leaves its absolutism undergoes three stages: its oneness, he-ness, and I-ness in that sense. So even that, if you read, so even that he quotes, for example, when famous Einstein statement that universe is finite but unbounded. So the way Iqbal tries to interpret it is, Einstein is quite right in saying that universe is finite but boundless. It's finite because it's passing phase of God's extensively infinite consciousness, and boundless because the creative power of God is intuitively infinite in that sense. So we'll read it in the when we try to see this Shuhudi and Wujudi debates. But here I want to add a couple of points. Is that maybe the time in which first Iqbal wrote Asrar-e-Khudi and Rumuz-e-Be-Khudi, maybe 1908 and 1916 and 18, you can see Iqbal is trying to maybe he is trying to maybe have three strands of thought. On the one side, he is trying to come terms to the wisdom of the age. The age was technological age, might have been scientific, and on the other hand, the interpretations, the way mystical interpretation of Islam, which was maybe there is a school which and a certain viewpoint in India or Persia, Persian metaphysics, which led you to an appreciation of matter and mind and life, which was passive in that sense, and that realization. So on one side, the Nietzsche's idea of eternal return, even though it might be boring, but in the process of trying to negate things, in the process of trying to what I should say, give solution to nihilism, which comes from eternal recurrence, where the will to power or truth is power, that realization, that tumult, that energy which is required. So he is working in these strands, But on the one side, he's not impressed upon by the Nietzsche's ultimate, it's out and out materialistic of 19th century, godless in that sense. But he is not also impressed upon by that passive attitude, which is led by a certain mystical interpretation from Hinduism or from Persian metaphysics, from or some Persian poets in that sense. So he's these conflated ideas. He's trying to make, if you want to have a more sympathetic view of Iqbal, he's trying to synthesize the two in a unique way. If you don't want to give him the original thing, but you can see it in that way. If you don't want to prescribe originality to Iqbal, but at least you can say that he tried to synthesize these strands which were existing and the societies in which he was living in. Now we are coming to another idea, for example, which is there in these passages like Wujudi debate and the Shuhudi debate, where, for example, Iqbal talks of, for example, his critique in pantheistic Sufism obviously cannot favor such a view and suggests difficulties of a philosophical nature. How can infinite and finite ignorance mutually exclude each other? So, in that sense, the notions God is infinite and the world is finite, and whether world is how world and God are separate. So, if God is universe, so what are we? How are we different from the universe in that sense? So it's a very careful. How can people have a construct? So if we just say in the Iqbalian words, he talks of Asrar Khudi. There are three stages. Itaat means complete surrender to law, Zabt nafs, self-control, and Niyabati ilahi, the resurgence of God, means man having reached a certain stage. So in that sense, if we want to differentiate Iqbal's Superman, he comes through a certain different trajectory that's known as Insani Kamil as compared to Nietzsche's Superman in that sense. So here I'll quote before going somewhere, maybe I'll quote some Urdu passages in that sense, and which will set, and where I'll at the end try to give what the gist of those sentences, or where we can relocate it. The debate, important debate, is that something called wujudis and shuhudis. A lot of people will say this wujudi and shuhudi distinction is not strict, it's arbitrary, it's not required. But people take it seriously in that sense. Some people take it seriously. It's not, so you have to be clear what you want to say. For example, so what is it? Before coming to what it is, we will just read some sentences which will make things clear. बंदाए मजहब जिस शख्स को ईश्वर कहा जाता है, इसके बारे में लिखा गया है कि वो बैक-वक्त, so if I take the Hindu point of view, बैक वक्त आदमी पुरुषा भी है और प्रजापति भी है. उपनिषद के मुताबिक इंसान के अंदर रूह दो तरह की है, एक सेल्फ एंड फ्रॉम ए बॉडी यानी गैर मादी जिसका नाम आत्मान है, दूसरा गैर मादी जिसका नाम आत्मान या सेल्फ एम्बॉडीड, इसका नाम जीव आत्मा है, और जो हकीकी रूह है उसको सत कहते हैं. सो दीज आर कैटेगराइजेशन इन द Hindu way of the Upanishadic way of looking at sense. But how the Muslim Sufis or these have seen it. So मौजूदात का दूसरा ही नाम खुदा है, यानी खुदा मौजूद की सूरत में खुद को जाहिर किया है. इसका ख्याल मानने की इस्तिलाह तसव्वुफ में वजूद आइनिया कहा जाता है. हक ताला मौजूद दात से मावरा है नहीं, बल्कि इनके वजूद का ऐन है, ऐन में है, ऐन करके सरायत किए हुए है. ये वही नुक्ता नजर है जो हम ऊस्ट या पैंथिज्म के नाम से मारूफ है. हक ताला अपने महबूब बंदू के अंदर हुलूल कर सकता है, और इस वक्त में बंदा रब के दरमियान जो हिजाब है वो उठ जाता है, जो हिजाब है वो उठ जाता है, और बंदे का हर कौल व फ़ैल खुद अल्लाह का कौल व फ़ैल बन जाता है. मुहिद्दीन इब्न अरबी की हैसियत नजरिया ये है कि कायनात और खुदा एक दूसरे के ऐन हैं, अल्फाज दीगर कायनात ही खुदा है और खुदा ही कायनात है। नताइज के एतबार से इन तीनों गिरोहों में पहला गिरोह इस कायल है कि आलम खुदा के मौजूद करने से खारिज में मौजूद है और जो कमालात उस फलत आलम में है वो सब अल्लाह ने मौजूद किए हैं। और दूसरा गिरोह आलम को खुदा का वसीला कहता है, लेकिन इसका कायल है कि खुदा के मौजूद करने से खारिज में मौजूद होता है और जो कमालात सिफात है वो सब तक मौजूद है। दूसरा आलम खुदा का वसीला कहता है, लेकिन इसका कायल के आलम खारिज में मौजूद होता है। तीसरा ग्रुप वहदतुल वजूद का कायल है, यानी खुदा खारिज में एक मौजूद है और हक ताला की जात है। So we can say, if I want to say the gist of it is that if the God and universe if God is separate from the universe, or universe is itself a God, but if universe is itself a God, maybe there's a quotation where this is a quotation from Ibn Arabi says that the problem was not that you said that Christ is becoming God, but the problem was that you made God to be a Christ. Christ, yes. So in the Urdu he says that इंसान बंदा कितना भी आलो अरफा हो जाएगा, अल्लाह ताला से नीचे ही रहता है। अल्लाह ताला कितना ही नीचे जाए मगर अल्लाह ही रहता है। Means God can, if God even how much he comes down, still he will remain God, and how much else a man goes up, he will still remain a man. So he will have that the manhead and Godhead may not combine in that absolute sense that is there in that sense. So it can be more or less seen in that the words of so you can say in God is in if you say something in Urdu it's called ijmal and tafsir. Means if you see in its, if you want to, if God is a point, the universe is you can reach to its origin, and the origin is God or Allah. Or if the universe is the point, you can say it is pointing to something infinite, which is God. So these are two ways of looking at it. But our presence in this world, how is it if we are finite beings and in ourself we want to realize Creator Allah? So how the process of self purification will dissolve that distinction, and a lot of things will get cleared about us and about the larger realities about us, which maybe wujudis and shuhudis have tried to grapple with some fundamental differences also in that sense. So here maybe if I want whatever I have said, there are a couple of things. Maybe Iqbal quotes a lot of verses of Quran towards that effect. But the thing is that throughout the book you will say that Iqbal is very much repellent of materialism. For example, you see, the most depressing error of materialism is that supposition that finite consciousness can exhaust its own object. Means the fundamental transcendent character of this thing, that you cannot ultimately reduce the reality out there, whether of our inner world or the external world, to materiality alone in that sense. So here there is something more to it in that sense. So here you can say so here we can say, for example, so which Iqbal talks of barzakh. Barzakh is sort of intermediate stage in that sense, and there is an interesting paragraph which may connect this paragraph. Maybe he might have written it in 1930s, but people nowadays who work in sleep research. This paragraph may be interesting in that sense. Once we go to sleep or once we go to slumber, so how does our conscious and unconscious? Is there telepathic, or is this our consciousness is only basically emergent properties of our how the different parts of the brain work, or how our memory, how our brain stores information, or how does our brain process these dreams. So if for example, he says the enormous condensation of impressions which occur in our dream life and that exaltation of memory which takes place at the moment of death discloses the ego's capacities of different standards of time. The state of Barzakh, therefore, does not seem to be merely a passive state of expectation. It's a state in which ego catches a glimpse of fresh aspects of reality and prepares himself for the adjustment of these aspects. So it's not that sort of eternal recurrence. It's like that you are beneath, there is some eternal now, and you are gradually being aware of that thing. And maybe sleep or dreams, or it may be a manifestation where you can have that inkling of that idea in that sense. So here, now the thing is that there are uh, so before coming to the sleep, for example, there is a particular prophetic saying which says "Takliku bi iklakullah," which Iqbal turns creating in yourselves the attributes of God. Means there is a particular verse in Quran, "Wama ramaitahu iza." So God did not throw you through the stones. So in the idea of being closer to God, you have sort of God-like sifat or properties can be associated with you, but they cannot be seen in terms of that tajseen, in terms of you can exactly catch it in that sense, in the material sense, in that sense. Human minds are too small to just address that thing. Now we are coming to the end part of it, where Iqbal is trying to see the notions of Darwinian notions, and he has to talk of a particular Muslim Ibn Maskuya. He's an important thinker, sociologist, biologist, and zoologist, or whatever you might call them. Because in medieval times, people were not could not pigeonhole people in one particular discipline. A sociologist was a biologist, he was a zoologist, he was an exegist, he was a muhaddis, he was many things. Depends. It's not the regimentation of 20th century or 21st century that you are somehow forced to, or maybe circumstances force you to just maybe don't go into a discipline lifetime in that sense. And there is always crisscross the lack of communication or lack of understanding or misunderstanding as far as the different disciplines are concerned. So epistemology as a subject is not taught a subject of all subjects. So this is the attempt of Iqbal, and in the light of that attempt, we are also trying to attempt things in that sense, and maybe in the sense that a lot of developments have taken place since that time, hugely in that sense. So now, in the sense that the way this Ibn Maskuya and Rumi try to see notions of evolution, biological evolution, people like Darwin, people like Spencer, people like Lange, people like Marx. So they do not try to see evolution in that theistic sense. Even people like Nietzsche. So in the later stages where he says, Paul says of Nietzsche that he was blinded by his progenitors, including Darwin. Nietzsche was blinded. So the notion of theory of evolution, it has not been theistic in that sense. So the Iqbal is quoting passages from Rumi and Ibn Maskuya, maybe on page 121 and maybe in page 133, he's quoting Ibn Maskuya. He extends his theory of evolution to plant life, not only animal life in that sense. And the important point is that even though Iqbal is not averse to the idea of biological evolution, whether plant or animal, whether organic or inorganic, but he's saying that sort of hopelessness, the faithlessness, which either this Nietzsche's idea of eternal recurrence brings, or which theistic Darwinian evolutionary sensibility gives, or a mellowed down Spencerian interpretation of Darwinian thing. For example, Herbert Spencer, he quotes in social organism, for example. So Spencer's appeal at that time, since he was a globalist, so he was a cosmic evolutionist and liberal anti-imperialists who emphasized social management and reform, and who deliberately and extensively on proper on why on function and development of state. His ideas proved appealing everywhere from US to Japan, India to Ottoman Empire. So if you there's a book rereading Darwin. So there's a good interesting passage rereading Darwin Arabic. How the this Darwinian debate, this Haeckel's this ontology repeats phylogeny. The Darwinian constructs, how they were once translated in Arabic, how thinkers like Obdu, these people in Indian subcontinent, how these theologians, how they try to reinterpret. Some people were taking Darwinian ideas in full sum, but some people, some theologians, whether it was many theologians, they appropriated Darwin with a pinch of salt, trying to see it in the previous way, maybe not entirely atheistic in that sense. For example, for Amin, like so many other Arab thinkers at that time, the encounter with Muslim world was itself an example of struggle for life between the nations. Maybe in that sense, this adage, when we talk of big fish eats smaller fish, large nations maybe subsume smaller nations. So even the very idea of notion of nation, apart from this, taking survival of the fittest seriously, sociologically also taking it seriously. Now, whatever I have said is that, so in that sense, there are some modern day debates in theory of Darwinism, where we don't have normal Darwinism, we have synthetic ways of looking at Darwinism. Darwinism allow some modifications, post-Mendelian Darwinism, post these notions of punctuated equilibria, and a lot of ideas where, for example, this question, whether is cultural selection selective in that sense. So, for example, our culture, it's typically assumed that if something has an extraordinary characterization, it must be result of cognitive uh, abilities of brilliant mind in that sense. So here I want maybe the important point is that once you connect the genera with the specific ANVA, yeah. So if you want to see a particular phyla of plant kingdom or an animal kingdom, the biggest problem is how to classify a particular phyla in the larger group, the species. And in the process of speciation, when a new species comes into being, so the whole sort of augmentation of natural selection, the cultural diversity, the environmental factors, the genetic drift, and other vocabulary which we use to explain things. So, in that sense, you can say that For example, in physical sciences, this is important point. In physical sciences, as compared to the biological science, the physical science is the notion of law is, in a sense, a very general sense, because there are not much exceptions to the rule. Or exceptions more or less follow. You can derive from the law. You can explain the variety of ways of experiences. But as compared to the biological sciences, there are always exceptions to the rule. Means exact animal or a plant species may not be fitting to either group or phyla. The characters may be somewhat masquerading both of them, both groups or species. So it becomes very problem. So exceptions to the rule are allowed in biological sciences or social sciences more as compared to the physical sciences. So if that is the case in that sense, so it may be uh, so so so. So maybe there are different discoveries in the theory of biology. So you can talk not of evolutionary systems, we talk of extended evolutionary systems. And there, how is the criteria, the way we have a Popperian criteria or a criteria of how we can judge or reject a given theory if there are always exceptions to the rule. So here, people like Faribault, people like Thomas Kuhn, they talk of something called incommensurability, which can be how we define it. It can be defined as a lack of natural standards from which to compare and assess the merits of competing theoretical frameworks or enterprises in that sense. So we have to understand paradigms or disciplinary matters as we would call them as all encompassing guides of conducting science that till succumbs how to approach new scientific problems in that sense. So Kuhan referred to impossibility of natural paradigm complexes as incommensurability. So as Kuhan pointed out, each paradigm or theoretical framework includes a series of metaphysical beliefs that guide interpretation of directly observed phenomena, that's model. And the concept of space is not an observable phenomena but a very broad ontological category and beliefs. In for example, flat curved space are not empirical claims, the way we said previously that if we talk of metaphysics not being possible, but it's also a metaphysical claim. These curved spaces, they are not fundamentally a priori. Even empirical claims are also metaphysically metaphysical claims, but in an empirical sense. So a priori, if we don't have any absolute framework. And in the case of biological sciences, the huge this evolutionary paradigm, we have exceptions to the rule, and how can have those we have standards by which we can the incommensurability criteria. So here we have the ontology in the evolutionary biology. How can the and here maybe there's a biologist called Stephen G. Gould. He's an evolutionary biologist. So he has talked of these how we can see extended evolutionary hypothesis or synthesis in some how we can see these Darwinian notions in that not a stricter sense, such that if the popular evolutionary thing it has won, so evolution has not to be seen as a mindless game where organisms survive for the fittest. It can also be seen sort of as sort of cooperative mechanisms where even sometimes there is a sort of people sacrifice. So it's a huge means organisms cooperate also for the larger goal or purpose. So that purpose may not be defined as it cannot be directly seen by divine, but it cannot be against the divine in that sense, or some purpose in that sense. So large disciplines of genetics, linguistics, evolutionary biology, ethnology, population genetics, paleontology, neurosciences, evolutionary psychology. For example, in case of language also, for example, there's a particular quotation of, for example, Darwin, where he talks of, for example, so Darwin, just so if I don't remember, so what Darwin was trying to say that. So if I remember correctly, so if maybe I may not be right, but the gist of the sentence goes like this: that in order to go from chimpanzee to baboon, or from monkey, so you need a sort of metaphysical. One second. One second. Yes, Darwin also felt that evidence of intelligence in animals was one way to analyze apparent gulf between man and animals. He who understands baboon, wrote Darwin, will do more towards metaphysics than Locke. So you can see the typical intelligence of the age, the Darwinian way of looking at things in that sense. So trying to closely see the if monkeys and humans have some, or monkeys or baboons have some special similarities in that sense. That metaphysics should be like that. This is what Darwin says. But if we want to, the success of Darwin, if we want to invert it, we can say it. So there should be there should be evolutionary ways. If there are more exceptions to the rule, and there is not one paradigm where we can judge these evolutionary theories, so you have to have this different explanations have also to be accommodated in that sense. So this is the point. So here at the end, here maybe Iqbal is also trying to give a very different, since we are talking of destiny of mind and matter, and we're talking of human destiny. So the Quranic way of looking at Adam and Eve, or the biblical way of looking at this thing. So if we at all invoke a theological anthropology in that sense, so the notion of heaven and hell, maybe it's not, it has to be taken literally, or it has not to be taken in the materialistic strict sense. Maybe Iqbal has been criticized by a lot of theologians on this point, where, for example, Iqbal says heaven and hell are not localities. Their description of the Quran are visual representation of inner fact, that is their character. And hell, in the words of Quran, is God's kindled fire, which mounts. So he talks of heaven and hell as failure and successes of human ability to reach at some point in that sense. A promise of appreciating or not appreciating a reality in a certain sense. And the recipient of divine illumination is not merely passive recipient. Every act of free ego creates a new situation, and thus offers further opportunities of creative unfolding. So in that sense, you can see the notion of human self trying to appreciate a certain reality or ego, or certain self, notion of self, which is appreciating the reality, the ultimate reality, which is not outside, which can sometimes be inside the self, and that reality make us closer to that ultimate reality. So this thing is placed in a background, which maybe Iqbal was link in the 19th century, 20th century. So the ideas of Nietzsche, ideas of eternal recurrence, ideas of mindless biological evolution in that sense, and a certain notion of time, which was, or a certain materialistic philosophy, or a certain denial of metaphysics. You can say it that way. So you can contextualize all of these ideas, and maybe see some post-Darwinian debates. Uh, where the evolutionary paradigm has to be seen in some newer lights also in that sense. So I had maybe tried to connect a lot of these ideas. Maybe you hope you find them interesting in some sense. Thank you.